This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Welcome back, everybody. Well, I know it's been a while since we've had an episode to this podcast, and I apologize for that. You can expect a lot more frequent and content coming from me in the near future. I spent the last week in Belgium. It was an amazing trip, kind of a mix of making content for my YouTube channel, but also being a part of a fantastic tour. So I spent about 5 days in and around the Ypres salient, in Western Belgium, making videos about the battles that took place there. And then the last 2 days I spent on a tour of sites related to the Battle of the Bulge with a fantastic group. There were about 50 of us that included a couple of the folks that were in Band of Brothers, specifically Phil McKee, who portrayed Colonel Strayer, and Matthew Leach, who played Floyd Talbert, as well as Freddie, who was one of the people involved in the behind the scenes. He does have a scene, Freddie Joe Farnsworth does, where he's riding on a horse at the Battle of Carentan, but he was one of the military advisors on that. All fantastic guys, so glad I got to spend time with them. In the coming weeks, I'm going to be doing some podcasts associated with that trip, sharing some of the stories that I told in my YouTube channel, but also some of the stories that I learned on that trip as well. And we're going to be diving into one of those stories today. World War I, which at the time was known as the Great War, was one of the deadliest wars in human history. Estimates vary, but something probably around 15 to 20 million people died as a result of the Great War. About half of that being military deaths, the rest being civilians for various reasons. But even in the midst of a great war, the armies of every nation had to deal with the problem of crime and punishment. When you're dealing with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of soldiers on the front lines, you basically have entire communities. You have these divisions of 15, 20, 25,000 men. That's a small town where most of these countries are. And so you've got infrastructure built around that. You've got people living in close quarters. You've got to provide food and shelter and clothing, and you have to provide justice in those situations because there is going to be crime anytime you have large numbers of people put together. And so there was military justice, and there were military courts, and each army dealt with those things in different ways. But specifically today, we're going to look at the British Army and how it dealt with crime and punishment. We will talk a little bit about some of the other armies in the midst of all of that. But if a soldier was judged to have committed a grave enough offense in the military service, they could face a number of different punishments: imprisonment, there could be hard labor, even death. But for a death sentence to be approved, at least in the armies of the British Empire, it first had to be confirmed by the commander-in-chief in the theater. Over the course of the Great War, over 3,000 British, Dominion, or colonial soldiers were sentenced to death, but most of those sentences were eventually reduced to imprisonment, field punishment, or suspended altogether. And I should point out that when we're talking about the British Empire, we're talking about all of the countries that were under British rule in one form or another, or politically tied in some way to Britain. So we're talking about not only the United Kingdom, which is England, Scotland, Wales, and at that time still all of Ireland, but we're also talking about their dominions. We're talking about Canada. Newfoundland was a separate part of the British Dominion. You have Australia, New Zealand, but you also have India. You have South Africa as a part of that, and you also have parts of the Middle East. But out of the entire British Dominion, there eventually were 346 soldiers who were executed by firing squad. And most of those happened on the Western Front, France and Belgium specifically. And I'm actually looking at a chart for executions in the British Army by year and based on what offense they committed. In 1914, which is the first year of the war, the war starts at the beginning of August of 1914, so the second half of the year. There were only 4 executions in the British Army in 1914. 3 were for desertion and 1 for cowardice. Now you go to 1915, and that number starts to climb. You have 46 desertion executions in 1915, 4 for cowardice, 2 for quitting their post, 1 for disobedience, and 2 for committing murder. In 1916, the number jumps again dramatically. 71 for desertion, 10 for cowardice, 2 for quitting their post, 3 for disobedience, 4 for murder, and now we add 3 new categories for which people are executed. 3 for striking a superior officer. Imagine that in the heat of the moment, you hit a superior officer and boom, you're executed for it. Didn't happen often, but it did happen. 1 for casting away arms, throwing down your gun and saying, I'm not gonna fight anymore. And 1 for mutiny. 1917 is the peak of executions in the war. All of those categories, again, but now we add 2 for falling asleep on post. A total of 104 in 1917. And then in 1918, there were 46, 10 for murder in 1918, by far the most. But the majority were for desertion and 1 for quitting post that year. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the crimes for which these men were executed. There were some who were civilians, some such as the Chinese Labor Corps, which were civilians but were under military law. The one lone exception within the British Empire and Dominions was the Australian soldiers. The Australians made up a big chunk of soldiers on the Western Front, and they lost something like, I think, 13,000 Australians were killed on the Western Front fighting. But they had no executions for any of those crimes because the death penalty for Australian soldiers, the Australian government had transferred the power to confirm the death sentence from the British Commander-in-Chief to the Governor-General of Australia, a man named Sir Ronald Munro Ferguson, and he always reduced death sentences for Australian soldiers to imprisonment. So a couple of interesting things as I'm looking at all of these numbers, and there's a lot of analysis of the Army. They're broken down by division, by what type of force there were, those things. There were, basically what we're dealing with are about 300 executions that took place for some form of desertion or cowardice among the British armed forces during the First World War. The interesting thing to note is that the majority of those came among either the regular army, which what we're talking about is the army that existed before the war began. These are guys who were career soldiers. And then you have the volunteer army, which are the people who they're sometimes referred to as Kitchener's New Army. These were guys who signed up voluntarily because they wanted to fight, because they were answering their country's call to go to war. And then you have the conscripts, people who were drafted, people who weren't given a choice. The vast majority, and by vast majority, I mean almost all of the executions happened among the regulars and the volunteers. There were 25 executions among conscripts, and the vast majority of those took place in 1917. So it's interesting to note that these men who end up being convicted of desertion were men who voluntarily signed up for the army, who went to war because they chose to. But there's a big kind of cloud hanging over all of this, and that is the understanding of what we know today as post-traumatic stress. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. But first, let's talk about what went into one of these executions. Once a death sentence was confirmed by the commanding general, it wasn't long before it was carried out. The men were taken to a suitable location as near to their place of confinement as possible. And I had an opportunity to visit one of those places in the town of Poperinge, and we're going to talk some more about that later on. But in Poperinge, it's really just maybe less than 100 yards from where the cells were to where the actual execution took place in town. So they were taken to a suitable location pretty close to where they were confined. And then, according to a book called The Procedures for Military Executions for the British Army, it called for a squad of 12 men armed with rifles commanded by a lieutenant, or lieutenant as they'll call him in the British Army. And steps were taken to avoid any undue strain on the enlisted men who made up the firing squad. Though, as I'm going to share with you in a minute, that didn't mean the strain wasn't there. So when the squad arrived at the place of execution, their unloaded weapons were laid on the ground, and the men were actually led out of sight. The officer present would then load 10 of the 12 rifles with live rounds, and 2 with blanks. This is something we've all heard before, and it did actually call for that in the Procedures for Military Executions. And so the theory was this allowed each man in the squad to believe that they had fired the blank round and therefore had not actually killed the man. Now, of course, anyone who's fired something like a Lee Enfield rifle knows that it's probably pretty easy to tell the difference between a live round and a blank one, especially if you've fired rounds before. So how much that really worked, I don't really know how much that is the case. But in most cases, after the volley had been fired, the sergeant who was a part of that squad would then pull out his pistol and put a bullet in the head of the condemned man. We call that a coup de grace. Sometimes it would be the officer present who would do that. But it was a very brutal and very efficient way of dispatching with the condemned man. You know, I haven't taken a lot of time in my life to think about the psychological effect that it must have on the common soldier to be commanded to be a part of one of these firing squads, to execute one of your own fellow soldiers, especially for these guys who have been on the front lines and fought alongside these guys for a couple of years and had to deal with all of the horrors of war, and to know how many times you've probably had it cross your own mind to want to get out of that situation by any means necessary, to then be ordered to kill one of your own. It must have been horrible. And I've actually got some sources here, some descriptions from some of the men who were involved in these executions and what this experience was like for them. One of them was a man named Arthur Savage. And this is what he wrote about it. He said, "I was ordered to go on a firing squad in 1917. The man was led out by a military policeman and a priest. Then he was tied to his post. He only looked about 20 and wasn't very tall. An officer went up to put a blindfold over his eyes. I could hear his voice now, as clear as me and you talking in this room. He said, 'I need no blindfold over my eyes. Curse you and your blindfold, and may the judges who will surely sentence you one day show you more mercy than you've shown me.' Then we had to take aim. My hands were shaking so much, so I aimed about a foot to his left. Then we fired. There were 9 of us, and only one shot caught him in the side. He slumped forward, wounded. So I was not the only one firing wide deliberately. The captain walked up to him and put a bullet into his head. Some of the men were sick. Others were crying. Most of the poor sods were mainly convicted on the evidence of doctors. They would not accept that men could reach a point of utter exhaustion when, as a result of trench warfare, their nerves and brains would snap. These so-called doctors would not have it that there was such an illness as shell shock. They insisted that the men were cowards and deserters." At the age of 14, Victor Sylvester ran away from school and joined the army. In an interview he gave just before his death in 1978, he described how he was ordered to execute a man for desertion. This is what he said. "We marched to the quarry outside Staples at dawn. The victim was brought out from a shed and led struggling to a chair, to which he was then bound and a white handkerchief placed over his heart as our target. He was said to have fled in the face of the enemy. Mortified by the sight of the poor wretch tugging at his bonds, 12 of us, on the order, raised our rifles unsteadily. Some of the men, unable to face the ordeal, had got themselves drunk overnight. They could not have aimed straight if they tried. And contrary to popular belief, all 12 rifles were loaded. The condemned man had also been plied with whiskey during the night, but I remained sober through fear. The tears were rolling down my cheeks as he went on attempting to free himself from the ropes attaching him to the chair. I aimed blindly, and when the gun smoke had cleared away, we further were horrified to see that although wounded, the intended victim was still alive. Still blindfolded, he was attempting to make a run for it, still strapped to the chair. The blood was running freely from a chest wound. An officer in charge stepped forward to put the finishing touch with a revolver held to the poor man's temple. He had only once cried out, and that was when he shouted the one word, "Mother." He could not have been much older than me. We were told later that he had in fact been suffering from shell shock, a condition not recognized by the Army at the time. Later I took part in 4 more such executions. So you heard in both of those accounts something that I've been finding is a pretty common theme in a lot of these executions, and that's what we call today post-traumatic stress. In this case, they were still in the midst of that stress. These are men who, at the time, were going through something that was called shell shock, but was not widely understood. The descriptions of the thing we call post-traumatic stress, it was known as shell shock in World War I. They called it battle fatigue in World War II. It's had different names in different times. But as early as the 1850s, we see this being described during wars like the Crimean War and then the American Civil War. Men who are placed under just unimaginable amounts of stress and put in some of the worst of situations. In this war, the Great War, this is a stressful situation. This is a horrible situation to be in. Every war is, but there were unique things about this war that made it even more awful. The nature of trench warfare, the nature of the heavy artillery that exists by this point, the nature of these horrible attacks in which you were either running through no man's land, watching most of your comrades get killed, or you were in a trench wiping out entire sections of men attacking you. Either way, it was just this horrible circumstance. Living in trenches with rats and disease and the bodies of men. I mean, the stories of men digging trenches and coming across the bodies of their buddies from a year earlier because they're still fighting in the same place and having to remove pieces of bodies and put them in sandbags so they can keep digging the new trench. I mean, and I could go on and on about the horrible nature of this warfare, but suffice it to say that it is a completely understandable thing that men just cracked. They snapped. They reached a point where physically, emotionally, mentally, they just could not take it anymore. And I am not here passing judgment on that. I think that is a perfectly reasonable thing to have happen in these kinds of situations. And as I've read through some of the accounts of some of these men who were executed, they were very clearly dealing with that level of stress and had no business being on the front lines at all. So we're going to talk about some of those stories. I want to share some of those stories with you. Specifically, I visited a town called Poperinge, which is just a little bit west of the town of Ypres in western Belgium, near the French border. And Poperinge was far enough behind the lines that it was kind of a place of respite for the British soldiers, but it was also a place where things like military trials could take place without being under constant threat of artillery and attack and things like that. And so in Poperinge, there's a British Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery that's called the Poperinge New Military Cemetery. It was established in June of 1915. And it has by far the largest collection of executed men of any cemetery on the Western Front. I think most of the cemeteries on the Western Front have a handful, at most maybe 4 in one cemetery. But Poperinge has 17 in this cemetery. There are 677 Commonwealth burials, probably about 300 in the section where these 17 executed men are. And what's interesting about it is there's no way to tell, walking up and down the rows of this relatively small cemetery, there's no way to tell by looking at the stones, the markers, who was executed, who died of disease or accident, who was killed by enemy fire. There's no distinguishing between one or another. Now that's different from, say, when you go to the Voisin American Cemetery in France, where the executed Americans of the Western Front are buried, of the European theater. They're in unmarked graves in a completely different section of the cemetery. No names, just numbers. And, now granted, these were men that were executed for a lot of other reasons, but there was at one time at least one man, Eddie Slovic, who was buried there because of desertion. Completely different way of dealing with it. And many of these families didn't even know that that was why their loved one had been executed or had been killed. They didn't know. I mean, some of them did, but in many cases they did not. So I want to share the story of some of the men who are buried in Poperinge, and just to give you a sense of some of the circumstances that led to these executions being carried out with these men. Herbert Morris was 16 years old when he enlisted in Jamaica in December of 1916. He arrived in France in April 1917 as a part of the 6th Battalion of the British West Indies Regiment. On August the 20th, 1917, he went missing from a work party in the Ypres salient. He turned up the next day at a rest camp in Boulogne without his rifle, any equipment, or a leave pass. So he was arrested. On September 7th, at his trial, he went unrepresented by any sort of a defense. He made an unsworn statement saying that he could not stand the sound of the guns and that the doctor that he had seen on August 19th gave him no satisfaction. So this was a young man, just a teenager, who had gone to see a doctor about the fact that he just couldn't stand to be on the front lines. He's already dealing with this. He was too young to have even enlisted. At the time, you had to be 19 years old to even be at the front. But I don't know the details, what he means by the doctor gave him no satisfaction, but apparently what that meant was that he was not given any pass or any sort of relief to be able to get off the front lines. But despite him offering that as a defense, no medical examination was ordered, and the doctor was never called to testify. 2 of his officers testified that Morris had never given them any trouble and that he was a willing worker. But it also further appears from the evidence that Morris had gone missing at least one other time on the 16th of July. And at that time, he was given 2 weeks of field punishment before being sent back to the line. He was found guilty of desertion. The punishment was confirmed by the commander-in-chief, and on September 20th, 1917, Herbert Morris was executed. He was 17 years old. Eric Poole was born in Canada in 1885, but his family moved to England at some point before the war. In October 1914, he volunteered for the artillery. Eventually, he was given a commission in the infantry, and he came to the Western Front with the 11th Battalion of the West Yorkshire Regiment. In the first week of July 1916, while fighting at that horrible battle at the Somme, he was nearly buried alive by the close impact of an artillery shell. And while he survived that explosion, he came away with a severe case of what was then known as shell shock. He was medically evacuated from the line, but he returned to the front at the end of August in command of a platoon in C Company. On October 5th, he went AWOL as the battalion moved back to the frontline trenches. 2 days later, he was arrested and put on trial for desertion in the face of the enemy. His court-martial began in late November with 6 witnesses called to testify. One of them was a doctor who testified that Poole was in a psychological condition that had rendered him unfit to be placed in charge of a command at the time of his actions. It was shown that Poole was confused at the time he went AWOL and didn't seem to understand the seriousness of his actions. Even the officers in charge of the court-martial acknowledge that he appeared to have been suffering from a nervous collapse at the time of the offense. Despite all of that, he was found guilty of desertion and sentenced to be shot. On December 3rd, a few days before the sentence was set to be carried out, he was examined by an Army medical board. But the board concluded that he was, quote, of sound mind and capable of appreciating the nature of his actions, end quote. Remember, this is now weeks, actually months after he's been taken off the front line. He's had 2 months to recover. He's had 2 months to come back down from the place that he was when he was on the front lines. Of course he was in a much better position. It's just baffling to me when you read this stuff, especially when you read that Eric Poole's brigade, division, and corps commanders all recommended that his sentence be commuted. But the commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Forces, General Sir Douglas Haig, confirmed the verdict and sentence. And he noted in his diary that it was, quote, highly important that all ranks should realize that the law is the same for an officer as a private, end quote. On December 10th, Eric Poole became the first commissioned British officer to be shot at dawn during the Great War. Now, it's important to note that not every executed soldier appears to have been suffering from shell shock. George Everill, who's buried right next to Herbert Morris in the same cemetery, was executed 6 days earlier, was a member of the 1st Battalion of the North Staffordshire Regiment, and he was probably one of those men. On separate occasions, over a period of 18 months, he was convicted of using insubordinate language, of willful defiance, of absence without leave, and of using threatening language. Following his punishment for the last offense, he was again convicted of willful defiance, for which he was serving field punishment when he was warned to be ready to move up for active operations. When the unit was mustered later in the day, he disappeared. He left his rifle and his equipment behind. He was found and arrested the next day. At his court-martial, he chose not to question any witnesses and made no statement in his own defense. He was shot at dawn on September 14th, 1917. Private Albert Troughton had fought bravely in his last action with the 1st Battalion, Royal Welsh Fusiliers. But after being notified of his brother's death, he wandered off for 3 hours and was arrested. He was tried for desertion and sentenced to be shot. On April 21st, 1915, he wrote a letter to his family that was smuggled out of his jail cell. This is what he wrote. Dear mother and father, sisters and brothers, just a few lines to let you know I am in the best of health and hope you are, mother. I am sorry to have to tell you that I am to be shot tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the morning, the 22nd of April. I hope you will take it in good part and not upset yourself. I shall die like a soldier. So goodbye, mother, father, sisters, and brothers, if any left. Remember me to Mr. Kendall and them who knew me. Mother, I'm very sorry nothing happened to me at Ypres. I should not have went away, and then I might have stood a good chance of still being alive. But I think they are paying the debt at the full rate. I thought the most they would give me would be about 10 years. It is worse than waiting to be hung. I hope you got my letters, which I sent you while waiting for my court-martial. It seems that something told me I was going to be shot, so I think at the time it has come for me to die. I am only a common soldier, and all civilians should know that I have fought for my country in hail, sleet, and snow. To the trenches we have to go. All my comrades have been slaughtered, which I think everyone should know. Even when our regiment was captured, the colonel loudly strained everyone for himself. But on and on I fought, and I got clear of the German trenches. This is the punishment I get for getting clear of the trenches. I have written my last letter to you all at home. So, Mother, don't be angry with me because I have gone to rest. And pray for me, and I will pray for you. Remember me to Mr. Newbold and tell him about it. I've been silly to go away, but if you knew how worried I was, almost off my head. Think how we have been slaughtered at the beginning of the war. You think they would have a bit of pity for those who are living for their country. Goodbye to all at home. Goodbye. Goodbye. From your son, Albert. Just a postscript to this story. On November 7th, 2006, the British government issued a posthumous pardon to the soldiers who were executed for military offenses in the Great War.